I'm going to talk to you for around about 20 minutes, if that's okay, about building an education system through leadership and collaboration. But in doing so, to talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do in this role. By way of introduction, my background is, like many of yours, I suspect, having been a teacher and a head teacher and a chief executive up until September 2014, when I became the Regional Schools Commissioner for the South West. And then I came into this role in January. And when you come into a role on this scale, one of the things that helps is seeing the world still through the lens of headship and thinking about, in any situation that you'd likely to be in, you'd need a plan. You'd need a development plan of where you want to get to and how you're going to get to. So what I'm trying to do this afternoon, and what I will do in the next few minutes, is talk about what I see as kind of the really big picture of where we need to get to, where I think we need to get to in the next 4 or 5 years, and then give you a taste of the 2 or 3 things that I'm going to do, which will hopefully accelerate us to that particular journey. I want to start by talking about the challenges that I think we need to meet if we're going to honour the commitment that we heard in 1997 when Blair stood on the steps of Downing Street and talked about his commitment at being education, 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 and when Sir Michael Barber set up his delivery unit and he talked about world-class education system in this country. I have no doubt that in the last 20 years we are closer to that than we've ever been. However, the rest of the world's got better too. And so therefore we've got some challenges, I think, in terms of those gaps. So I think there are 3 things I'd like to say will underpin what it will look like when we get to world class and how we're going to do it. The first one is that we need to stop talking about structures and talk about structures to create better standards. So if you think about our recent past, where we've talked about becoming an academy, setting up a multi-academy trust, as if that was all you had to do in order to improve standards in schools. And if it was that easy, then we may well have done it a bit quicker. So it's not just about structures, it's about structures to get better standards. The second one is that we need to be thinking with our young people in school that whatever age they leave compulsory education, the view that they have is that their education is just starting, not finishing. So it's a bit trite sometimes to talk about the jobs that young people will do in the future haven't yet been invented. Some of that's true, but we're probably still going to need the odd doctor, the odd surgeon. We may even need a head teacher or a teacher. So therefore, the notion that we are preparing children for a world which is going to change is true, but we also need to make sure that children paint a picture of taking new skills, new knowledge, acquiring new expertise that will enable them to take their place both in society and in the workplace. And the third one, I suppose, is around how do you achieve that? And one of the real functions of the world-class school, I think, is to help children see where they fit in terms of their locality, their region, their nation, and internationally. So, of course, it's true that sixth form students in the future will compete with children from Singapore, from Germany, from the States, for university places and for employment. But fundamentally, it starts in our localities. It starts by creating young people who understand what it is to have a sense of place. And I think world-class education probably starts from those 3 things. Let's go to 2022. And I picked that date deliberately because that's the point at which the job I've been asked to do is meant to deliver, which is 22,000 schools in the system will be academies. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through this. But yes, some things I feel very strongly about that we need to get right. And here's the first one. I think the culture that every school in the system has to be a giver and a receiver of support in equal proportion is critical to this. The landscape that we've had in recent times, particularly in terms of school-to-school support, has been based on the idea that great school gives some goodness to a weak school and it gets better. If you take your medicine, you'll improve. It's not as simple as that. And one of the points I want to make this afternoon is that school improvement is really messy. But when it's at its messiest, it's at its most effective, because it's not straight-line thinking that drives improvement in the system forward. So if you are the teacher or the head teacher of one of our best schools in the country, whatever, and you'd have to get the question right to determine what the answer was to put you in that group, the one thing I'm absolutely certain after teaching as long as I have is you won't be great at everything. There will be gaps. However, because most of the things in your school are truly good, truly outstanding, you can compensate for those gaps. They cover them up. But those schools that don't identify those gaps and do something about them are the ones that fall from 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to special measures. But if you've ever worked in a special measures school, and it's been a real opportunity I've had twice in my career to do so, There is great practice in a special measures school. There just isn't enough of it. But the idea that the special measures school has nothing to contribute to partnership is false. So that's my first key driver to get us to 2022. The second one is this. We have currently in the system 973 multi-academy trusts that are operating. 973. Almost 90% of them have 6 schools or less. So this is an evolving system. This is still an immature system. It's not something that's been in place for 30 years. The concept of multi-academy trusts, as we talk about them today, has been around for about 8 or 9 years, tops. So this idea, particularly post-white paper, where what we heard was that some of these large national chains were going to drive around the country and hoover up all these rural primary schools, is a nonsense. When 90% of our trusts have got 6 schools or less. 6 schools tells me that's probably a local collaboration. There are only 10 trusts in the country who have more than 30 schools. Only 13 trusts that have more than 25. But here's the thing. Let's conceptualize this and say, what if 973 trusts becomes 3,000 trusts? When I was a head in 1997, the landscape looked like this. I was a head in Gloucestershire, 43 secondary schools in Gloucestershire. They were all dots on a map of Gloucestershire, and they were dots because they didn't communicate, other than when they went to the annual or the termly Gloucestershire Secondary Heads meeting. The fact I can remember how awful it was 17, 18 years later tells you how much of an impact it made upon me. But that was the height of collaboration in 1997. But the risk is this. 3,000 multi-academy trusts who assume that you can be collaborative inside your trust, but you put a ring of steel around it so you don't talk to anybody else, creates that new landscape 30 years later. So the second priority for me by 2022 is that multi-academy trusts work together. And they take really seriously the educating a town, educating a city, educating a community concept. My most recent leadership experience was in Bristol, where I went in 2003 up until I became the RSC in the Southwest in 2014. And whilst Bristol still has a number of challenges, Bristol is a success story. And it's a success story because the leaders in that city got educating a city. They understood their responsibility to help children across Bristol, whether or not they were in their trust or whether or not they were in their schools. And one of the challenges that we have in some of our other cities is that the rhetoric talks about that, the practice is not there yet. So trust coming together and working is a really important part of it. The third thing we've got to crack, and we've got to crack this a bit quicker than 2022, is this conundrum of recruitment and retention. But I put them two together because they're two sides of the same coin. Yes, we have a recruitment crisis. It's not the same everywhere, is the truth. It's tough in most places, but some places it's really, really difficult. But we have a recruitment problem, partly because we have a retention problem. And in primary, it's the end of year 3, and in secondary, it's the end of year 4. Why is that? I think it might be something to do with this. I'm going to paraphrase this, and this is going to be a gross parody of it, but I think there's got something in it. I'm an NQT, year 1. Every day is tough, every week is tough, every term is tough. I haven't got time to be miserable. I've just got to get through it. Year 2 gets easier, because our whole profession is about rhythm. It's about the rhythm of the academic year. We have open evenings in September, first parents' evening in October, talent evening in November, Christmas you get it. We're in that cycle. Year 2 is easier because we've done it once before. Year 3 is not necessarily easier, but it's the same. And I think what happens in secondary particularly, and possibly in primary, is that does that mean I'm going to carry on doing the same year for the next 20 years? And I think the remedy for that sits in our school system. We can influence that. I would want to be talking about a dialogue with people that were coming into the profession about a 10-year plan for the new teacher, the 21-year-old that's going to come and join our profession. And it looks something like this. Year 1, you're an ITT, you're training. Your first real year, you're an NQT. Why do we assume that at the end of year 1, you're made, you're baked, you're the complete teacher? Because I wasn't after 25 years. And I wasn't a bad music teacher. Year 2, I think, should still be a newly qualified teacher year. Forget whether there's a formal qualification, but the sense being that you still contribute to your development. Year 3, you take on the mentoring of a newly qualified teacher. Year 4 and year 5, you have a post that sounds something like a lead practitioner, And your job is to work with other people in your school to build pedagogical practice across the organisation. Year 6 and Year 7, that first middle leadership post might be available to you. It could come sooner. Year 8, your trust, your school should be thinking about developing you as a senior leader. Year 9, Year 10, if you're good enough, if the vacancy exists, if the need exists for your skills, your first leadership post. And if you said that to a group of people on their initial teacher training year, that was the picture, that was the landscape they were walking into, that Year 3, Year 4 hemorrhage would be challenged because people could see the pathway through it. And I want to use that rhetoric a lot in this job. So how are we going to get there? That's my first question to myself. I've got 2 strands to my delivery plan, and I want to talk about them in a bit more detail, if that's okay, before you ask me any questions or any comments you might have. What I'm clearly doing here is touching my phone so the battery doesn't go, because I'm trying to do this from memory with the odd slide, but I haven't got my glasses because they're in the car, so this is challenging. The first part of it talks about growing the capacity of the system with care. The growing the capacity of the system everybody uses. The with care is new. Because here's the deal. If we grow some of our trusts to 30, to 40, to 50 schools or more, and they fail, that's catastrophic and probably isn't repairable. Because even in that trust of 50 schools, if 20 of them fail, you're going to have to draw so much resource from the other 30 that they're going to fail. So I want to make absolutely sure that as we grow our existing trusts, we have a plan in place, an audit, a health check, which I'll describe to you in a minute, that enables us to be really confident that those trusts that want to grow can do so. Because when we talk about trusts growing too fast and too big, that's not the whole picture. One of the reasons why the early trusts failed wasn't so much about their size, it was because they gave autonomy in exactly the same proportion to their strong schools as they gave to their weak schools. It was because the trust itself didn't have a school improvement model that was cohesive across their schools. And in some cases, it was because the geography was ridiculous. 1 school in the northeast, 2 schools in the northwest, 3 in the southwest. There was no cohesion to that. So I don't subscribe to the view that you can't grow a trust to 30 or 40 schools. But if you get the leadership right, the structure right, the governance right. So I'm part of a group of 60 schools, but in my family of 5 schools in Cornwall in that trust, it feels like a very sensible local collaboration. That, I think, is deliverable. The other side of this coin is this. Let's say we get to 2022, and my colleagues and I have been successful, and all of schools in this country are academies. But in 2022, the results are shocking. That's not a success. That's a failure. So the second side of this is how do we improve the system strategically? How do we find a way to make sure that we improve schools and keep them improved? And those are the 2 dimensions to the plan that I want to do. So let me talk a bit first about the performance challenge. And I want to put a proposition to you. My proposition is something like this. I struggle with the notion when we describe schools by their Ofsted rating. Simply because there are schools that are outstanding today that were first inspected and last inspected in 2006. And I don't believe you can be outstanding every day for 10 years. And one of the reasons why outstanding schools slip is because that lack of ability to flex the Ofsted muscle, whatever we think about it, knowing that you have to be really good at self-evaluation does help in that sense. But I don't subscribe to the view either that the school was judged 18 months ago to be requiring improvement is still requiring improvement today. Because they could be good, or they could be special measures. So I want to build a rhetoric around school improvement that talks about the messiness of school improvement, but builds a logic into it. And this is what I'm thinking of doing. Phase 1, I'm going to call the declutter phase. Phase 1, I'm going to call declutter. And in the declutter phase, what you see is a broken school. Staff absence, student attendance, behaviour, standards, morale, recruitment, governance, deficit budgets, all the things that you know about are all there. The only truth about leading in a phase 1 declutter school is that on day 1 when you take the school on, it's worse than they told you. The second phase is the repair phase. And by now in the repair phase, you're beginning to exert some control over the chaos. Some of those early strategies that you put in place to improve behaviour, get kids into school, enabling teachers to feel supported and resourced to teach, are beginning to bear fruit. However, on a wet Wednesday afternoon in December, it goes straight back to being declutter again, because it's fragile. The third phase I'm going to call improve, because at this point you're flipping from being reactive to being proactive. And some of the strategies that will bear fruit in 3 years' time are the ones that you're now leading. And whilst the outcomes probably will never go back to where they were before, you are still vulnerable at times to a poor set of results. But you know that you see them coming, you can anticipate it, and you have a plan for what you're going to do when they come. And then the fourth phase I call the sustain phase. And I use the Maslow hierarchy of need, that top part of the pyramid, the self-actualization bit, to support what happens in there. Because in this point, the school is confident, it's innovative, it's starting to take risks, and it's starting to help another school, because it can. The reason why I think that model might have some traction is that you can apply those 4 phases to a trust, you can apply them to an individual school, you can apply them to a department, or you could apply them to a year group. So that when we talk about schools being RI, do we really mean the whole school? Or do we mean English and maths? When we say it's special measures, is it every kid's behaviour in the school? Is it every member of staff that doesn't come in when they've got a bit of a sniffy nose? No, it's not. So taking a different approach to that is important. And where it helps me in terms of my thinking about leadership is that you've got different leaders for different parts of that journey. So I've worked with some amazing people in Bristol who are brilliant at phase 1 and phase 2, the declutter and the repair phase. Really, really talented people. But you can't do it for 25 years because it's grueling, it's draining, and it burns people out. But here's the journey, isn't it? Special measures to good, that's hard. Good to outstanding, that's tough. Outstanding to outstanding, that's tough. But they're different journeys, and they're different skills. And my thinking is that in the system, we need people that can do at least 2 of those journeys. And in a single academy trust, in a single school, if you want to refresh your leadership team on that journey, you have 3 ways to do it. By losing your best people because they get promoted, because you can't give them your job, because you want your job. Number 2, you have to pay more money to get more people in. That's not realistic. Or thirdly, you decide they have to go. That's not a great model either. In a trust where you've got maybe 25 senior leaders, you can specialise and move people into the schools for the right part of the journey. And one of the myths is, well, trusts move people around because they can. It looks good. It gives people professional development. It does all of that. It actually is about putting the right people in the right place. And that's one of the reasons why I want to link that phase 1 to phase 4 improvement cycle to the type of leaders that we need. Let me take the second part of what I wanted to talk about, which is the growth model, and talk very briefly about this. There are 4 types of trusts I conceive in the system. There are starter trusts, which will be the first 5 schools, probably the trust would set up. But all the way through this, we've got to be talking not just about schools, but students as well. Because 5 schools in Cornwall might be 350 kids. 5 schools in London, if they're all secondaries, could be 6,500. So you can't just say crudely, it's the number of schools. It's the number of schools and the number of children. But the starter trust is an interesting part of this, because we're going to need those. We're going to need to grow our existing ones. We're also going to need to develop new ones. And they will grow into my second phase, which I'm going to call established trusts, which is roughly 5 to 15 schools, up to around about probably 5,000 children. And both of those first 2 are probably going to be within a local authority, or certainly within a region, I would think. The third level up, I'm going to call regional trusts. If you've read any of the interviews I've done since I was appointed, I started by calling those national trusts. But someone got there first. So I've changed my thinking. But also I've changed my thinking because actually some of these trusts of 30 plus, they won't be national trusts. They will be regional trusts, and some of those will be dioceses because of the size of those groups. And then the fourth group I'm going to call system trusts, the ones that will by definition have schools across the country, have probably half a dozen RSCs they might have to talk to if I wasn't overseeing that particular bit of work. And my thinking right now is that if you want to cross the threshold from starter to established, or established to regional, you should go through a health check to reassure yourselves, reassure your board, but also reassure the RSC and myself that you're equipped to do it. Otherwise, we will grow the wrong trusts and we'll see more failure. So in order to conduct that audit, there are 5 areas that I'm going to ask people to take a look at. The first one will be standards and track record. Because if you've got 6 schools today and 3 of them are doing worse than when you took them over, why would I give you any more? There's got to be a sense that you can improve schools. The second one is about people and leadership. So let's imagine that trust of 5 schools is going to create another trust of 5 schools 10 miles away. The executive head or the chief executive of the 5 can no longer do that over 10. You need somebody to go and run that cluster. And bearing in mind what I said before, it's better to be in a cluster of 5 than a trust of 20, because that's where you look to for your support and your challenge. So we need to be sure those trusts have developed people over the last few years to do that. The third area is around financial sustainability. So, for example, if a trust had a financial notice to improve, it's probably not a good idea to give them more schools so they've sorted that out. The fourth one will be about governance, not just at the board level, but also at the school level. I think if you build a delegated framework around these 3 things, you get that distinction between what the board of a trust does and what the school board does. Number 1 is, what's the educational experience through the eyes of the children? What's the experience through the eyes of the staff? And the experience through the eyes of the parents. So if on the basis that the trust should be looking at all the other things around strategy, risk, finances, health and safety, all of those things, give the academy board the sole responsibility for standards and development in the school, and you suddenly have a role for people who've been governors for the last 20 years, because that's what they like doing and that's what they're good at. My thinking at the moment is that the best people to do these audits are people like you. So this is not going to be consultancy city. This is going to be about trust of 10 auditing trusts of 5, trust of 20 auditing trusts of 12, because they've been on that journey. Even if they got some of it wrong, there are lessons to be learned from making mistakes that you can feed into it. So my thinking at the moment is that's what we're going to introduce. Next week, we do our first 5 pilots of that, just to see what it feels like. And in September, we're going to do the next 50, which will take us up until Christmas, and I'm going to stop and see what we've learned, see if it works. See if it's doing the job I want it to do. And eventually, the system will do it for the system, and our job will be about quality assurance and moderation. What it can't be, however, is my mate down the road comes and does my review, and you do his. It's got to be much more rigorous than that. There's got to be grit in it, so that if it's not good enough, people are prepared to tell you. And if I can get that bit right, then I think it will work. On the other side of the equation is the bit I talked earlier about the performance. And the way I'm going to approach this is that the 100 weakest academies in the system, secondary schools in the first instance next year, are going to report directly into me, so that I can hold the regional schools to commissioners to account for the support that those schools get. Because here's another statistic which is quite horrifying. The 100 weakest secondary schools in the system probably educate around about 60,000 children. This is interesting. The 100 weakest schools, when I did it in 2015, only 63% of them were requiring improvement or special measures. A third of them were good or outstanding schools, yet their data put them in the bottom 100, on attainment, albeit. And I'm not going to look at attainment, I'll probably look at Progress 8. But the idea being that if you think the success of an education system should be the degree to which our capacity, yours and mine, improves the weakest schools to give the most vulnerable children a better education, that should be a test that we should be able to pass. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, I'm going to look very closely at those schools and answer this question. How do you intervene, and what strategies do you use if you want to improve an entire education system? Because we know how to do it in a school. I think we know how to do it in groups of schools. We have never tried to do it on this scale that I'm now proposing across an entire region, the north of England, the southwest of England. And it's going to be different. So one of the things that will come out of this piece of work over the next couple of years will be a clarity around that. And I want to make a couple of points to finish with and then take your questions if that's okay. I've talked a lot about leadership in this session, and I want to make another point about it, which is about the type of intelligences that leaders will need in the future, particularly when they're leading in collaboration. And I divide it into 2. The first one I describe as impact intelligence. And what I mean by impact intelligence is you know, through your own experience or the experience of the people around you, what you need to do technically to improve things. So you know how to improve teaching. You know how to improve a child's attendance. You know how to support a child with mental health issues. You know how to improve phonics. You know how to develop your middle leaders, etc., etc. And that's a really, really important intelligence and skill set. Alongside it, you need to have an emotional intelligence, though, because unless you're able to take people with you and create fellowship to go with the leadership and create a dialogue which people can buy into that understands what their contribution is, then actually you've just got a plan and you won't be able to deliver it. And if your leadership team is predominantly made up of people who are really high on impact intelligence, I suspect what you've got is a great leadership team who have lots and lots of ideas, but not many of them get into classrooms. And if you've got a team that's really high on emotional intelligence, you've got a lot of people who are really happily engaged in the journey, but will get frustrated because the things that they know need to be improved aren't improving. You need a leadership team around you that can do both. And so I think if you put my 4 phases and the leadership around those 4 phases with those intelligences, you begin to see a sense of how I see the next 5 or 6 years in terms of how we need to develop our stock of great leaders in this country. And my conclusion is, we're in term 6. There's about 3-4 weeks to go, I guess, till the summer holidays. If I was still in school, there would be 6 questions that I would be posing myself, my team, and my governors. And I thought I'd just share those with you. The first one is, and I think we should do this every year, but it's particularly pertinent at the moment. Number 1, are we delivering on the promise that we made to raise standards in our school? It's a really simple question. Are we delivering on the promise that we made? So if you're an academy or a free school, you will have signed a funding agreement that said you were going to do exactly that. I've not seen a funding agreement yet that said we were going to get worse. So on the basis that you made a commitment to get better, how far from fulfilling that promise are you this year? And ask it again next year. That's number 1. The second question is, what do parents like about the way you educate their children? And I don't mean a survey. I don't mean the Ofsted parents' view. I don't mean that. I mean genuinely engaging them about what they like about the school and how they feel engaged with you and your leadership team around the offer that you're making. I think that's a different question, and it's a deeper question that will inform your practice going forward. Here's question 3. Do you care enough that a school in your neighbourhood is in difficulty? Because you should. The challenging question for the outstanding or good local authority maintained school who wants to stay on their own or become a standalone academy is this. Number 1, go back to my giver and receiver of support analogy. If you're outstanding now, who's going to challenge you to plug the gaps that you currently have? That's number 1. Number 2, your best people that got you to good and outstanding are going to leave you because you're not going to be able to offer them that next job. And number 3, it's number 3 on the list, it's number 1 in my mind. Your moral duty is to help children who are not getting the same education as the children you provide for yours. And if I've seen one thing shift in those 20 years, I think it's this. When I was in Gloucestershire in 1997, I used to hear examples of secondary schools in Gloucestershire going into special measures and hearing in the same breath a head in the same room with the head of that special measures school standing next to them saying, well, that means we'll get more year 7s next year and I've got a head of maths job coming up and your head of maths will come and work for me. That was the landscape we had 25 years ago. We don't have that anymore. And I think that's a real success. My 4th question is, what are the current relationships and partnerships that you value that at no cost would you want to lose? And in some cases, those partnerships might belong to one school in your group or one school in your alliance. Not everybody. But there are some trusts in the past that said, when you join our club, you come and play with our friends. That's not right. The notion that we continue to build collaborations beyond our own organisations is really important around that one. Question number 5, what does our current performance tell us about our areas of provision that needs help? So I don't mean just the weighing the pig bit, I mean the fattening the pig as well. There are lots and lots of people, myself included, and probably some of you, who are brilliant at weighing the pig. Data mechanisms, all those dashboards, all the clever stuff that analysts will do will tell you exactly what the problem is, but there's a so what question about it. So you know that year 8 white working class boys on a Wednesday afternoon don't turn up to maths. Great that you know it. What are you doing about it? So that's number 5. And I suppose number 6 is a future one. What are the challenges coming down the tracks that you know that you can anticipate, that you want to have a plan for? What are those going to be? And they'll come under headings like finance, they'll come under staffing and recruitment, they'll come under succession planning, they'll come under talent management, curriculum development, progress measures. It'll be all of that. But fundamentally, this is how you manage your risk. Risk management isn't waiting until you have the challenge and then working the risk out later. Great risk management is about anticipating it. And those are the kind of questions that I would get you to think about and to have that conversation with. So if I summarize the three things that I've tried to do today, it's number one is, as National Schools Commissioner, in the short time I've had with you, I have a plan. And I'm going to try to deliver this plan to improve our education system. I can't do that plan sitting in the sanctuary buildings in the Department for Education. I try to avoid sitting there longer than about 3 days a week if I can. But for 2 days a week, I do a lot of this. Yesterday, I spoke at the FASNA conference. I think it was yesterday. Might have been, was yesterday Wednesday? Yes, FASNA conference yesterday. And that was the 50th keynote I'd given since January the 1st. I don't tell you that because I want you to be impressed. You probably think it's awful. But it's about 5,000 people I've spoken to about this vision, about this message, about where do people fit in the system. That's really important. The second message I'd want to give you is this. Whatever you're thinking of doing in your organizations, whether it's under growth or development or partnerships or structures, do not do it at the expense of standards. Do not set up a multi-academy trust to bring your friends into a safe haven where you think you'll be protected. Build communication and collaboration and trusts around school improvement, so that the children that you've got in your schools today and their younger brothers and sisters get a great deal and a better deal going forward. And number three, I suppose, is around leadership, which has been the theme I've talked about throughout the presentation, and this notion about leadership belonging to every single part of your school. And I'm going to finish with an anecdote. So in September last year, it's not an anecdote actually, it's a story. In September last year, I was still the South West RSC, and I went to visit Nova Heriot Academy in Swindon, because Nova Heriot had gone from 29% 5A to C's English Maths to 62. So it was the largest jump of any secondary school in the Southwest. And I turned up on September the 2nd, I think it was, which wasn't an inset day, it was their first day of the school year. And I went because I wanted to see the staff in their morning briefing and say well done, because they were the most improved school in the Southwest. And after we'd done the staff briefing, Darren Barton, the head, said, should we go for a walk around the school? I said, yeah, that's great, that's good. It's lesson one of the year, but we'll do it. And we went down a corridor, and outside the corridor was a young teacher with a class of Year 9 students, set 4 of 4 of English. And she was talking to them outside the room, and we didn't walk past her, we waited until she finished speaking. And she talked about the children, about what they were going to do today, what they were going to do in the next 4 weeks, what they were going to do by the end of the year, what they should look out for and they'd be excited by, what her expectations were of what they would do, hands up, I want everyone to make a contribution to my lesson, the piece of equipment they needed first in the lesson, and why there was a seating plan. And then they went in. 2 things. I saw a leadership conversation happening there. Great teaching, but it was a leadership conversation about setting expectations for not just today, but beyond today. And then it was even more impressive because that was the first lesson of her professional career. She was an English NQT. That was her first lesson. And that teacher will make a difference, I have no doubt. And she must be coming quite close towards the end of this year with that particular class. But I tell that story because it's an example of how leadership doesn't just exist with those people who've got a title and an office. It happens with everybody in the organisation when the culture is right. Thanks very much for listening. Those of you that have possibly heard me speak before know I speak quite fast and put a lot of information into it. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think, of our session. I'd be really happy to take any questions. And my young assistant here in the orange T-shirt will pass the microphone around. Could you say who you are and ask your question?
Of course, I'm Tom Reese. I'm a head teacher of Simon the Tennis Primary School in Northampton, a director of a primary multi-academy trust, which is 6 schools and becoming 7 this year and probably more and more. Really insightful, and it's really great to hear your plan. I'd just like to, in the context of Northamptonshire, we received a letter recently from Ofsted raising concerns about the standards in Northamptonshire. Lots of us head teachers also share those concerns about standards in Northamptonshire, and we're really interested about the mechanics of how the trusts will work together in the future, because there are pockets of excellence in the county, but it's this every child belonging to every school and notion of every head needing to raise standards across the county. Yeah. How do you see the mechanics of that working? Yeah,
that's a really, really good question. So it won't happen unless you do something, which is logical as an answer. What I mean by that is it won't happen if we just leave it to the goodwill of a few who believe it. So I get the sense that would be something that you'd feel quite passionate about. The risk of leaving it with people like yourself is that it'll happen with the people that you work with, and the people who really need to do this won't. They'll duck out of it. So I think you have to have some levers as to how you make that work. And sometimes you need levers around whether it might be about procuring together, making joint appointments together. I think teacher training together is quite a powerful one. You know, if we have a constant flow of different size skits all around the country, that's not going to give us a national strategy for ITT. There's got to be a bit of joined up thinking around that. In Bristol, and colleagues who work in Bristol will recognise this, there were, when I was there, 7 different teaching schools. They all ran middle leadership courses, and they all got 4 people sign up for them, rather than one get 28 people to sign up for it. So there's that notion of we don't do ourselves any favours in terms of how we build that strategy. I think, however, if you're going to really get that mat-to-mat integration, you need to think of it in 3 phases. Phase 1 is people like yourself, advocates, early adopters, who believe in it, want to do it, for whom you won't have to be persuaded. You'll just get on and do it. And then what you've got at the end of phase 1 is you've got some examples. Oh, that's what you meant when you said that. Phase 2, then, are the people who will drift towards it because they were interested, thought it might be really hard work. It actually was quite good. We'll join you. And then phase 3 is either about those people who are left over deciding to be part of that, or frankly not. Because at that point, you've got to decide whether you invest more time in it. And if after that period of time, they're still saying, no, this isn't for us, you sometimes just have to recognise on the 80-20 principle, you can persuade most of the people, but not everybody. But I think when you're trying to manage something really different in the way that you've presented the question, the secret to that for me is about finding examples quickly of things that work that other people couldn't possibly dispute, because it's a really good thing to do. So, you know, for example, you bring all of your most able physicists together for an A-level physics day, or I'm not off the top of my head. But actually, you couldn't, why would you do that on your own? 4 trusts doing that would create a really exciting feel to a day. So I think sometimes the power of persuasion, alongside the evidence that something different is happening, builds that momentum. Don't feel you have to go to the closest person.
You do. Go to the closest person. Goodbye.
This is leadership for you. This is about being assertive with adults.
I'm interested in leadership. I'm Jill Berry. I'm a former head, and just
I'll follow you on Twitter, Jill.
Doctorate. You do.
I know you do. Yeah, great.
Do a doctorate into leadership transition. So I'm thinking a lot about what motivates people to be leaders and what puts them off. And I think you're absolutely right. I like your story about the NQT showing leadership. Every teacher leads learning in their classroom.
Yes.
But a lot of people are put off leadership, especially headship in the current climate. They see it as high risk. They see it as unappealing. And quite insecure. How can we change that? How can we... I thought headship was the best job I did, and I say that all the time. Yeah. But how can I convince people that actually it's a joyful job which has huge satisfactions and rewards, but yes, it does have pressures and challenges when so many heads seem to be losing their jobs?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. Just some thoughts around that, I suppose. Firstly, I would say, yes, you're dead right, it is the greatest job in the world, but it comes with high risk. What I think I'm trying to do, I am not trying to put myself in any shape or sense, in spite of the fact that the Education Select Committee last week tried to do it for me, in competition with Ofsted or with Sir Michael. But I believe different things to him. And I think one of the things that I hope I've communicated today is my sense of how we get that messaging right. There are occasions, and I need to answer your question directly, and I won't sugarcoat it, there are occasions where the wrong head is in the wrong school, and change has to happen. And I've done that twice in my career, and they were really difficult decisions to make in the trust, but they were the right decisions. But those should be rarer as we go forward. In terms of the risk comes from our accountability system. And if we get some traction around the way I describe school improvement through those phases, it won't be the silver bullet that says your school is now this, as opposed to being this. Because actually, when you look at the metrics of your school, even in a really difficult school, you'll have pockets of outstanding practice. So in the special measures school that I referred to earlier on, the standout department, head and shoulders above any other school in the Cabot Federation, was art. Just inspirational, magical. Didn't help us much with EBAC. But nevertheless, there were pockets of great practice there, and it was a lesson that kids loved going to. And more than half, 3/4 of the year group chose GCSE art. So kids vote with their feet. So it's that business about having a different conversation about what school improvement looks like. And without wanting to sound like a stuck record, the third part of my answer is through the trust mechanism, because in a trust mechanism, you share that risk. If you're in a standalone school and you get it wrong, the light shines in one place. But if a school is part of a trust and the school fails, there are other people who need to look at themselves as well if that trust hasn't been successful. The chief executive, the governors, the other heads who may have denied the support that school needed because they wouldn't release someone to go and help that school. And that shared collective responsibility, I think, is part of the answer. It's part of it, it's not the whole answer. And around that will be, I think, a thought that people will take on those roles earlier, because they get that shared responsibility. In 1997, when I became a head, the phrase people were always using, well, the buck stops with you. Great. I wonder what that means in real life then. We don't hear that phrase so much because it's not. It's a collective responsibility. And heads, in my experience, welcome the chance to take accountability for their actions and their outcomes. They don't shy away from that. But if you are in a really difficult school and it's you against the world, that's a difficult place to be sometimes. So I think there's a language and a rhetoric that I've started in the last 6 months, which I'll continue to push in the next 5 years, that will hopefully overcome some of that. Okay, would like to take a couple of questions. Could I take the two questions in the middle together?
Yeah, Gareth Alcott from King Alfred's Academy, part of the Vale Academy Trust, and also a teaching school director for Oxfordshire Teaching School Alliance.
Hi.
I'm just interested to know how you see teaching school alliances working within that system, particularly if the alliance overlaps various trusts.
And your question?
Leslie Bowes, Executive Head, Mercia Learning Trust in Sheffield. Actually, I was going to ask exactly the same question, but also I do believe and sign up to the vision about head teachers being responsible for their cities or their regions. That moral imperative is very important. How will you matchmake when we have been encouraged for some long time now to be territorial, whether that's within teaching alliances or as we set up and develop our mats?
Yes. So I think I'll take the teaching school question first because it'll give me a segue into the answer to your question. So my view of teaching school alliances is that that's the army of school improvement. That's the source and the resource that RSCs should go to when they want to commission support for a school that needs help. But here's the challenge. There's 743 of them with a commitment to go to 1,000. Of the current 743, I guess around about a third should kind of stop doing it. Because I don't think they understand the difference between a bit of CPD and best practice and impact in the classroom. It goes back to the roots of 2011 when it was set up, and you'll remember this, when the National College talked about the Big Six, and they put school-to-school support on the same equal footing as the other five. We're not in that space anymore. If you want to be a teaching school, you have to be good at school-to-school support. I think you have to do ITT, and you probably have to do leadership development. And we should just say, if you're worth your salt, you're going to do the research and the CPD for free. Just get on and do it. So the challenge of what the next generation looks like is around that one. And I think the answer to your question is a challenging one. And the territorial nature of it comes from schools coming together for, in some respects, to set up trusts because they want that safety and that protection. And my line management, and that's what I now do, of the RSCs, is you need to be cute to that. You need to tell the difference between a partnership that's been put together to close the doors as opposed to one that's been put together to improve the children's education inside it. And I'm the moderator of that, not of every decision. I wouldn't have time to do that. But where RSCs are worried that they're in that space, they'll come to me and ask me to give them some external view of that. And I won't always get it right, and neither will they. But we know that's a problem. I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Have a great conference.